Hello everyone, today we talk about Roman Mauretania for our Roman Provinces series. Ancient Mauretania corresponded to the strip of African territory bounded to the north by the Mediterranean and to the south by the Atlas chain. Very sound geographical reference. From the east to the west, it ran from the course of the Amsaga River, now the Rummel, right on the border with Numidia, to the Atlantic Ocean. It had, as we will see now, its proper agricultural basin, so it was kind of a vast but well outlined region on its own, with its own cultural specificities and influences. The modern day countries essentially occupying its historical territory are Algeria and Morocco. If you look at the distance from Rome, you immediately understand that, if the Romans were at a point not particularly interested in Numidia or even in Spain, Mauretania is an even more distant land, exactly because of its size and capacities. Drew at point even more interest than other African provinces, right, in Europe. Now, the region was inhabited historically by various Berber tribes that lacked actually a unitary Mauritanian kind of identity as such. The Maori, in fact, were from after which, as you understand, the region was called, were only one of the most important groups that eventually would at least hegemonize the area, but still the tribal boundaries, also with, for example, the south, as we will see now, were not completely clear, and still, of course, from especially in the frontier, the least decentralization, the more actually the independent identity arose, even from smaller groups. The eastern area of Mauretania, so the one bordering with Numidia, was inhabited by the Massassuli, a people who in fact fell partly also under the control of the Numidian royal dynasty, at least the one that developed mostly for Carthaginian and Roman cooptation, but Numidia as a Berber country was also split in different kingdoms, chiefdoms, whatever you want to call them. And so there was naturally an overlapping space, let's say, between Numidia and Mauretania, as well as other areas in the south, for example. All these peoples, as we have observed, were tribal, right? So they were properly the native African interland, something very different from the Phoenician colonies, from Carthage. Also, there was an Hellenic province here and there. So a continental space and community that would remain always also beyond the direct control that eventually the Romans made in a, as you know, in the sense not just a coastal, but in part a territorial mainland. Still, however, not venturing too far inland, right? Only as necessary as quelling the rebellion, this or that tribe, put an end to raids and so on, was concerned, because there weren't many resources in the hinterland. These are, especially the western you go towards Mauretania, and actually the more agricultural areas you find, not, as we'll see now, so rich as the one of the Bagradas Valley that basically corresponds to Africa, to Tunisia, so what was probably also one of the most radically Romanized provinces in the entire empire. But surely not with the desert immediately just next door, like in Libya, right? And so it's a very extended frontier that the Romans were content of controlling with actually relatively few forces, right? Definitely the African frontier was the least garrisoned because it just took essentially to create some palisades, ditches, and so on. And so the various raiders, intruders would have to break at some point to concentrate all their strategic chance on speed, right? And the Romans would try to just bottle them by awaiting them at the same point they had taken out the defenses to when they were loaded in loot or something, and if they hadn't crushed them before, and so intercepting them at that point. And the system was somehow effective. Again, this was mostly, however, possible in the most soundly Romanized area, was mostly the one around today's Tunisia. The westernmost you went was not much a matter of, combat techniques or particular differences among these Berber peoples. Still fought practically in the same way, right? And also in an incredibly primitive one, we will describe perhaps later, and or in other videos. Based on, as you know, hit-and-run tactics, skirmishes, raids, and so on, mostly withdrawing at the advance of the largest, open field, kind of mobile armies. But in such a deep frontier towards the west, being complicated to just control from Rome, right? So, as we will see now, Mauretania actually gets an important attention from the empire, exactly in this dynamic of control that passes mostly through cooptation, also the possibility again of these Berbers to get Romanized, to contribute to say Roman campaigns in exchange of further recognition, colonization, investment from the empire in the first place, and the general success that these areas would enjoy, considering what they were coming from. Right, this series doesn't go beyond Diocletian, but as you know, together with Nepos, Syagrius, also the Mauryan kingdom in North Africa was one of the last chunks, right, at least officially, at least formally, let's put it in this way, of the Western Roman Empire surviving later on, right? Not because it had much to do with Romans, with Latin culture or whatever, but because it had been part of this broader imperial system that, as far as these peoples were concerned, was very advantageous just to maintain to a degree. And surely the Arabs later inherited part of this too. Just think about Ifriqiya even, but the Moroccan powers, the invasion of Spain from Africa through the Gibraltar Straits, right? So we have made videos about this dynamic of Atlas tribes that were constantly harassing the most civilized centers of the coast. Think about the Almoravids, the Almohads in high medieval times. But this was something that at a point, as long as the empire had existed, had been stemmed. At least the raids of the peoples from the Atlas or beyond the Atlas were successfully contained most of the time. This is an important political and strategic achievement because it means that the Roman presence in Mauretania met exactly with the support of the local population, at least considering the model of government and the deal that was formed. Another neighboring people were the Gaetuli, essentially in the desertic hinterland. Then even further south were the Garamantes, even though their center of power in Tanzania was shifted a bit more east than Mauretania. Were there any differences between these peoples? Well, historically, let's say the Numidians had been closer to civilization, so they had at least perhaps a bit more vertical society, right? Their elites. Doesn't matter how, again, scarcely stratified the same Numidia was, but in absolute terms. It really was something perhaps more more cultivated by the Carthaginians. The Romans would, the local elites could get in exchange for their military service. We will see Numidia and the Numidians in other videos. Mauretania had it was probably more egalitarian in nature. You see, also archaeologically, more swords around for the average trooper. There is perhaps also less of an equestrian bias than Numidia, right? Infantry thus is somehow more important, and cavalry is also more prone to mount this map. This is what also the Numidians did on a regular basis, the same Gaetuli, etc. But the idea is that Mauretania looks a bit more of a sanitarized area that is so in virtue of mostly the demographic agricultural dynamics and not much pressure from the outside, like in Numidia, for example. There are other reasons here we cannot digress on. We'll see it better in other videos, but this is it. The Gaetuli, or the Garamantes especially, were instead ultra primitives in many ways. The latter still used chariot warfare, just to make an example, and they lived properly in a very wild dimension. So the Mauretanians were slightly more civilized than them and slightly less civilized than the Numidians, let's put it this way. Just, of course, over time, when the Romans controlled them, etc., they would change also their politics, their society, their level of development. So in ancient sources, the Mauri appear alongside the Carthaginians in the expedition to Sicily in 406 BC. We find the trait of the Mauretanians serving abroad for these other peoples, were again, the Carthaginians, great mercenary employers, rich oligarchs that could, invest in that. And given that, again, the African hinterland was full of these warlike tribes that would have just gotten themselves killed much more easily than a Punic citizen, let's put it this way. And so you understand even a reach up to Sicily, right, against the Greeks, etc. We find Mauryan troops also among the supporters of Hanno in the mid-4th century BC, and in the defense of Carthage against the expedition of Atilius Regulus in Africa in 256 BC. So it's fascinating to imagine how the Mauretanian chiefs would essentially broker such alliance, such military contracts, etc. But it already tells you that they were sensitive to what was happening as far as Africa, as far as understand. I will call Africa Tunisia, right? As far as Sicily, etc. The Mauri, in fact, fought alongside Hannibal at Zama, together with the Numidians, right? In fact, others appear alongside Massinissa, the Numidian king ally of the Romans. There were, in other words, both Numidians and Maurians, both from Hannibal and Scipio's side, aside from the proportions, and this also reflects, as we know better for Numidian history, and we will see it even better in a video about the Zama campaign, some divisions between the various, again, tribes of these peoples. The Mauretanians were definitely not a unitary people again, and so every tribe had different interests that also entailed supporting either Rome or Carthage or this or that Numidian king, because at home this would have consequences that they would naturally use to try to emerge as the leading tribe in this era. No tribe had ever the capacity of controlling the entire region at all, but they were constantly fighting against each other, and in the process, if they had just been left alone, they would have, probably very, very late in time, even possibly the Middle Ages or beyond, just reach some sort of greater compaction. But the Romans and other peoples were going to just speed up the process under their own control. During the Jugurthine War, from 112 to 105 BC, you know what this was about. It was essentially a Numidian rebellion against Rome. The Mauryan king Bocchus initially sided with Jugurtha, that was in fact the Numidian king and rebel that had, as you know, previously served Rome with a substantial tribute of blood, participating together with Scipio Aemilianus at the siege of Numantia against the Celtiberians. So it's interesting to observe the connection with the Iberian Peninsula as well, because it turns out that also Celtiberian mercenaries were used by the Berber kings as bodyguards, right? And we're told, I made a video a couple of months ago about Iberian warfare, that Spanish cavalry was considered better than even the Berber one, because it was said could reach the same Berbers that were famous for running away and just killing them in hand-to-hand combat, because the Iberians had better armor, this kind of also simply a higher military quality, given that much bigger forces were clashing within Iberia, just because of the Iberian warfare, but also the Roman invasion, and so on. Right. So also the Roman necessity of employing Numidian auxiliaries during the 2nd century BC. You know, that there were Numidian elephants at the battle of Cunoscephali, etc. But as we were saying before, given that the Iberian theater was somehow sort of Roman Vietnam, except the Romans won in the end, and that in fact the Spanish provinces were shifted west enough to overlap longitudinally with Mauretania and Numidia, at least in part. The exchange between the two areas, this went importantly in parallel also with some administrative measures. Mints also were shared across the straits, right? That's something that perhaps we will talk about better in another video, but there was a close connection, right, between northwestern Africa and the Iberian Peninsula as well, already from that time. In the context of the Jugurthine War, and especially when the tide turned in favor of Rome, the Mauryan king Bocchus betrayed Jugurtha and handed him over to the Romans in the end, famously enough, right? To Sulla specifically. That was Marius' lieutenant. At that point, this caused also some debates about whose imperium really had made this poor divine servant of medium of Jugurtha was simply handing the defeated to the Romans. This was a clever move, by the way, because let's say Rome was evidently by this point consolidating. We are in fact on the eve of the Marian reforms. There is a further step ahead in Roman imperial expansion and properly possibility through professional forces of permanent occupation, greater initiatives for land assignation, thus colonization. So these African powers know that Rome is going to just control them better soon, and Bocchus, gambled on Jugurtha's victory, at least for a while, because they knew that on the longer run, what could these people do, right? They could maybe defeat the Romans once, but then, right, what was their chance of, dissuading them from kind of coming back again, especially in the control of the African coast that was so obviously civilized and that the Romans would have controlled anyway. But it was buying time for your own internal project. So at least when the Romans managed to, with orthodox means to, I say orthodox because, that's at least what made them win, starting to systematically destroy the various avant-posts of Jugurtha, etc., and obliging him to give up in the end. Bocchus realized, okay, let's side with Rome anyway, and let's make them this favor to show that at least we recognize who would have won and being considered part of it some way. In fact, Bocchus, either to probably only one of the several kings present in Mauretania, was rewarded with territorial concessions by the Romans, and he later appears in the sources as king of all Mauretania. This had been the right choice, evidently. The Romans, of course, didn't trust these clients so much, but again, conferring power to a single ruler, especially of such a turbulently fragmented area, was the best way to try to assert more stability in the region, so that the other tribes would be gradually crippled by the rise of this ruler. And if he would have screwed, first of all, he would have been more tied in that sense to Rome. That was, a warrant of such power by a degree, with military support, any kind of sponsor, etc. But that if he had screwed up, could have been more easily, identified, crushed, and if his power had been consistent enough to leave some local trace worth being exploited by some kind of other local ruler, it would have produced a continuity that the empire could keep using, right, on the longer run. Far from being a kingdom with well-defined borders, that of Bocchus, personally, was to be based above all on the recognition of supremacy by the numerous tribes of the region. This, of course, meant that the latter communities continued to maintain a large autonomy, large room for maneuver, let's say. This is reminiscent even of how, early modern Berber rule was in Morocco, right? The local chieftains would travel across the country, given their just at least ancestrally semi-nomadic lifestyle, to be recognized by this and that tribe, like being maintained fundamentally by each one of them along the way, in exchange for, again, protection and same and military service from the same. So there was no real fixed center, like a capital or anything yet, but certain, of course, the tribes had been, as we've seen, sedentarizing already from quite a while, and some list provinces had been forming within the broader region that corresponded to some sort of districts that revolved around the major centers. There is also this dynamic with the portual cities of Phoenician foundation on the Mediterranean, part also on the Atlantic across the straits, that were hegemonized by the Berbers of the hinterland. We're talking about Tanger, Tingis, Larak, Lixus, and Kerkel, Yol, which already belonged, by at least Roman recognition, to the broader realm of Mauretania. So it was a way of saying, okay, well, yeah, as let's say we can't immediately get there, you can have control on our behalf of the same coastal cities that were, again, civilization compared to the hinterland, and naturally provided with substantial income, connection with with the outer world, that as long as the cities had remained independent, that could not easily be done. Of course, there were local markets, but they were not under the control of these Berber rulers. And now they had de facto become. At the time of the clash between Caesar and Pompey, two brothers that were grandchildren of Bocchus divided Mauretania. This was yet another characteristic of tribal people. They split the inheritance among the male descendants. Bogud the First reigned in the western part, while Bocchus the Second held the eastern one. Both sided for Caesar, opposing the king of Numidia, Juba, that was instead an ally of Pompey. You know that that Africa remained one of the last outposts of, even after the death of Pompey. The local Roman rulers had also trained some legions from Numidian recruits. At that point, Numidia was basically just in the hands of the Romans, almost at least. And the Mauretanians were eroding the, let's say, this Pompeian rear, right? Also, Spain would be the last Pompeian stronghold to fall, because basically Pompey's veterans were there. But say in this peripheral context, there was something to gain in the process, right, by formally attacking essentially even part of what had been Roman territory. But in order to fight against Pompey supporting Caesar, this would provide them with some benefits, at least temporarily, because the situation, as you know, in the same Rome was pretty turbulent. In fact, there was a subsequent split of allegiance within Mauretania, as Bocchus sided with Octavian, while Bogud sided with Antony, right, during the clash between at that point the Triumvirs. It was Lepidus in the same Africa, but that didn't count as much. This aspect is, of course, going to make Mauretanian policy, because this Berber rulers would take the field even across sea for both contenders. For example, in 38 BC, Bogud was fighting in Spain, and at that point a rebellion broke out in Tingis, perhaps at the instigation of Bocchus. The latter, that, let's remember, was siding with Octavian, took the opportunity to invade his brother's kingdom with the help of some troops of the same Caesar's heir sent there to support him. Bogud returned at that point to Mauretania, but was defeated by these Mauretanian Roman forces and had to take refuge with Antony in Egypt, where he remained until his death in 31 BC. Bogud died specifically in Greece after Actium, right, fighting the same victorious forces of Octavian, right? So essentially for Antony, even though the cause was lost, and this tells you how much he had tied his own fortune to Antony. And this is the outcome of the clash between these two relatives. Bocchus, as you understand, remained the sole king of Mauretania. He died, however, 2 years before his rival. He ruled as Bocchus II, right? But having no children, on his deathbed, he bequeathed Mauretania to the same Octavian, right? This before, again, Actium, so before even just knowing how it would have really ended. We do not know, by the way, how such acquisition by the side of Octavian was managed, right? Because we know that the region does not appear in the provinces which swore to the victorious Octavian in 32, nor in those entrusted to him by the Senate in 27. Well, this tells us that Mauretania had basically granted herself to Octavian, but of course was ruled in a decentralized way still by some Mauretanian establishment. By this point, the consolidation of the Mediterranean after the civil wars, the incredible amount of wealth that Octavian managed to accumulate, wouldn't render it possible for Mauretania to have a dramatic liberty, right, in international policy. But it was still a distant and large land, right? So again, there was not particular attrition with Rome. If anything, a cooperation trying to make things work locally from both sides. We know that probably Tingis, that was formerly already a municipium following the revolt of 38 BC, and at least 11 other cities of the Kingdom of Mauretania received in this period Roman veterans and the status of colony. However, they were administratively attributed to Spain. It was already a province, and so the only one in which colonies of Roman citizens could be deducted. This tells you a lot, because generally speaking, Spain, especially the south, was Romanized from at least surely more than Mauretania for a consistent amount of time, and again was the most important land between the two. But there is still, and this is probably the point, right? That the coastal areas where most of these colonies were located, some were also in the interland, right? But the control in Africa was mostly through the coast, right? Then nobody really needed to send, Roman citizens to die in the interland, where there could be simply, forces loyal to Rome from the subject Mauretanians, right? So, in any case, in 25 BC, Augustus decided to install Juba II, that was the son of the same king Juba defeated by Caesar back in the day, as king of Mauretania. This recognition was crucial, because now king meant like the ruler of the entire region. Juba II was the right choice because he had been educated in Rome, as many subject princes, and had a reputation as a very cultured person. For example, he had been the author of various literary and historical naturalistic treatises in Hellenic language. He married in 19 BC Cleopatra Selene, the daughter of Antony and Cleopatra. This connection was really meaningful because, from one side, shows in how high regard the such Mauretanian pawn, right, was considered. This marriage would confer him some greater aura of prestige, not much because of the connection with Egypt, that naturally was distant from Mauretania, but say in Africa had surely a broader cultural influence, was one of the great Hellenistic kingdoms and so on. But through Antony's blood, Juba was becoming related to the same Julio-Claudian dynasty, so the imperial house of Rome. Right, this was a huge deal. Naturally, the children of Antony and Cleopatra were brought up in their own kind of Hellenistic kind of ways that just had barely anything to do with Rome. As you understand here, the same education, of course, among the Roman elite was contemplating Greek, but let's say these barbarians were more, they're speaking closer to the broader Hellenistic, well, not properly Hellenic kind of culture through the sea, given that the Romans mostly had nurtured their own civilization from, yes, in the mid of the Mediterranean, but from an Italic background, and now just in a sort of military, imperial sense was taking over and starting to influence culturally, mostly an Hellenistic Mediterranean. Through this appointment to King of Mauretania, the marriage with Antony and Cleopatra's daughter, etc., Mauretania became a realm perfectly integrated into Roman provincial politics. Right? Doesn't matter how decentralized it was, there was still an important connection with Rome. The capital Io was renamed Caesarea and redesigned in a style that combined Egyptian, Hellenic, and Roman elements for the aforementioned reasons. Right? All the Roman colonies, as you know, were built as little copies of Rome, with literally everything, the Temple of Jupiter, the Forum, etc. These other centers were in part containing that, but they also shared a more kind of customized type of tradition, just like we've seen it the other day with Creta at Kyrenaica, that many Hellenic cities there had just been recognized as free polis by the same Romans, and so under Rome, without Roman citizenship, of course, at least initially, they went on going with their own administration, just later on their own customs, etc. As with the adjacent Roman province of Africa, the main threat to Mauretania came from the warlike Berber populations living in the Atlas area, and especially from the Gaetuli. These, as we've seen, were a bit the rascals of the situation, and they were annoying enough for committing Mauretanian forces. They were basically similar, as we were saying before, in fighting styles, etc. But they were more difficult to bring down, because again, the hinterland there is semi-desertic, and you can't quite concentrate much forces for what, right? And these peoples had a semi-nomadic lifestyle. Interestingly enough, in Berber warfare, camels were introduced just at this time by the Romans, right, and imported them because they're not, naturally from inhabiting those areas, at least Juba or Yuba, telling the truth. Units fought alongside the Romans in the so-called Bellum Gaetulicum, won by the proconsul Cossus Cornelius Lentulus in 6 AD, and in the long struggle against the Numidian rebel Tacfarinas, starting from 17 AD. These clashes are interesting, especially Tacfarinas fought for 7 years, right, before actually succumbing against the Romans. The nature of these rebellions was mostly, contingential, right? There is probably not much that these peoples could have done. This is the time of also the Great Illyrian Revolt, or the same Battle of Teutoburg Forest. So of course, there were barbarians trying to win back part of their liberty from Rome, but in general, in the longer run, there wasn't much that, especially a Berber tribal background, could do against Roman forces. And in fact, also the Gaetulian attacks were repelled. The Romans launched substantially retaliatory expedition into their heartland. They gave a pretty clear idea of what would happen to anybody creating this kind of disturbances, if they were at least still alive, to contemplate that. And the situation would remain fundamentally like this, having, again, mostly a local elite gradually Romanizing and mostly coping by themselves just in their own local tribal disputes for protecting the broader frontier. It was essentially defending their own land, right? Was how the empire consolidated itself on the long run. Yuba died in 23 AD, leaving the kingdom of Mauretania to his son Ptolemy. As we've seen, there is a reason why they were taking Ptolemaic names in Mauretania. And as a descendant, in fact, of Antony, on his mother's side, Ptolemy was a second cousin at that very time of the reigning Roman Emperor Caligula. We've seen it in the video about the latter. Also, he was a first cousin of the future Emperor Claudius, because he was respectively the nephew and son of Antonia Minor, the daughter of Antony and Octavia, right? Augustus' sister. So that was an interesting relation also between the two, except Caligula, when he was in Lugdunum in Gaul in 40 AD, summoned Ptolemy and had him put to death. Right, and we do not know exactly why this happened. As you know about the Julio-Claudian, there are all the most weird kind of distortions from Flavian historiography. In this case, it's likely that Caligula decided essentially to cash through confiscation the assets of the crown of Mauretania, right? Given the financial needs of the time, this contributed actually Caligula's death. Aside the chit chat, actually Rome to have a substantial amount of wealth to be spent. We know that later because Claudius began immediately to do so. So evidently his predecessor was not a squanderer, as it's caricaturized like. In any case, this was done at the expense of the House of Mauretania that evidently couldn't quite oppose itself to much. We've seen it in the province of in the video about the province of Thrace, how these dynasties were gradually just being ever more dependent, first of all, on Rome, but how this had successfully gentrified, or at least put down most of the other more ambitious tribal houses, so that who could really oppose oneself now to the impressive potential of the Roman legionary forces, especially after Augustus' stabilization and so on. So gradually this system was simply entering in the Roman orbit. However, Ptolemy's death plunged Mauretania temporarily into chaos. In fact, a certain Idemon, presented in the sources as a freedman of Juba, led a rebellion that mainly affected the western part of the kingdom, so the most distant one from Rome, the one, say, from the other side of the mountains, also going down the Atlantic coast. The situation came back under control only in 44, so just after actually few years, and the campaigns of Suetonius Paulinus and Marcus Licinius Crassus Frugi, that evidently didn't have to sweat excessively, if not perhaps for the heat there. I mean, admittedly, it wasn't difficult to bring down again a Mauretanian rebellion at that point, but it's also not just simply a wall across the land, right? You must form the connections locally. You have to understand how and why this rebel, like what do they control, right? getting it back. It's only at this point, we are under Claudius, that, as we've seen, it is important as far as the consolidation of the Roman provinces is concerned, because Britain, Thrace, Mauretania came all at this point to be organized under him. And in fact, Mauretania was organized into two provinces. The Mauretania Tingitana, so the one with Tingis as a capital in the west, right? Tingis is just, again, south of the Gibraltar Strait, so on west and on the Atlantic. And Mauretania Caesariensis to the east, with the capital of Caesarea closer to Numidia instead. The two provinces were separated geographically and administratively by the Muluya River, and were both governed by imperial procurators of equestrian rank. Once Mauretania was pacified in this interludium, Claudius continued the process of Romanization, already, as we've seen, set in motion under Juba and Ptolemy. Roman veterans were installed at the Oppidum Novum, possibly an earlier Roman military outpost already. Other cities, including Lixus and Caesarea, were promoted to colony status specifically, so they became Roman cities as well. Other became instead municipia, including Volubilis, the beautiful ruins of you can admire, even I uploaded in the picture, on the slopes of the Atlas ridge. In still other cases, Claudius granted the rank of Latin municipium Latinum, or recognized the status of civitas peregrina to minor urban centers of Mauretania. These weren't Roman citizens, but some were starting to become, at least some would take a Latin citizenship that was, as you know, more commercially biased than the Roman colony instead, that essentially was born at least with military functions, as we've seen. And through this process, members of the Mauryan elite gained access to the Roman Senate as well. They were contained, admittedly, but still present. One of them, Lucius Quietus, was consul and an important general of Trajan and Hadrian, until, however, he was put to death on charges of plotting a conspiracy. Right, Mauryan cavalry, as we've seen, was a bit it was similar to the one of the Numidians. At this point, telling the truth, it was Mauretania was the region in which the Romans could get more cavalry, also of different variety, given the social stratification that the same Romanization had entailed. So combining these Romanized elites with the most warlike and tribal elements of this Atlas population. And as you know, the Berber cavalry was one of the most brave, not actually the most brave in terms at least of equestrian skills proper from an individual point of view, in the Roman army. Right, they were mostly skirmishers, again, but were also heavier troops, of course, and they were employed pretty far and wide across the empire, famously now. Again, they were wild, primitive, but exactly for this, they were good for this skirmishing, kind of looting, raiding, screening, exploring kind of functions. Now, it doesn't matter how connected with Rome, the Mauretanian province was still a foreign land, right? You could Romanize the elites, you could exercise direct control with Roman garrisons and so on, but these lands were not just, first of all, they were not civilized. You could have regions, like the eastern ones, were very superficially Romanized. They remained essentially Hellenic or Hellenistic in a broader sense in nature. These ones were consistently far. They were somewhat more stable again than the rest of the African hinterland, as we've seen, but they still required a significant number of troops to be controlled concretely. Right? There were actually no legions in Mauretania. Only various auxiliary units were located in the two Mauritanian provinces. In case of need, reinforcements could be sent either from the nearby Numidia or at the worst from Tarraconensis. But the area was still, if you look at it, also in Spain, there were very few forces in Central North Africa. There were very few forces, etc. So the entire area didn't have the potential to create a major threat. Again, you always think it in terms of political power, military deterrence, just the solidity of the empire. There is properly no political or military or social basis that from Mauretania can create any problem. Most of the land is mostly happy to maintain a more civilized level of the Berber average. Let's say they do not like when other, in fact, tribes push from the south and harass their fields, their estates, and so on. So that in many ways the country controlled itself by itself. Just you had to maintain a sufficient amount of forces, mostly for putting an end to, again, some brigandage, the incursions, other possible rebellions. Because again, if you do not control directly these lands, they will just try to autonomize themselves once again. So the balance was important, and it did require some expense from Rome. That naturally was worth it, even as we'll see now what Mauretania could give, and for the same fact that the Romans were there simply to stay. Speaking of famous names, Galba, during his cursus honorum, before becoming emperor, intervened in Mauretania Caesariensis during his proconsulate of Africa in 44-46 AD, while the imperial legate of the Legio Tertia Augusta, Sextus Sentius Caecilianus, was put in charge of the two Mauretanian provinces in 75-76 AD. Although in this case the reason was perhaps reorganization of territorial tax, which required, say, the process taking place more smoothly than somebody locally hoped for. Troubles in Mauretania arose, for example, under Trajan and Hadrian. A serious unrest affected, again, the westernmost, the Tingitana, perhaps around 145, forcing Antoninus Pius at the time to send troops from Spain and to place the two Mauritanian provinces again under the command of a single senator. In the 70s of the 2nd century, a Mauryan incursion interested even the Baetica across the Gibraltar Straits, which is fascinating because it tells how just much infrastructural support that they could get. Like if they wanted to invade, say to harass, this was just like a raid, right? Baetica was overbearingly wealthy, to say the least, much more than Mauretania, so they thought, just let's cross the strait. But this didn't actually succeed either, because this expedition was repulsed with the help of units led by the same Roman procurator of the Tingitana. That is to say, this expedition could be launched, even though part of the same province from which this was happening was in fact in the hands of the Roman government, and that could in fact simply thwarted in practice. Yet not before this, the invasion would actually be carried out. There is an important epigraphic document from the time of Marcus Aurelius, coming from Banasa in Tingitana. In fact, this document is known also Tabula Banasitana because of the place, and it shows that a certain Julianus, head of the Zegrenses tribe, so this was essentially a Berber, received, in fact, Roman citizenship in gratitude for his fidelity and obedience to the emperor. And this is fascinating as well. It shows to you how the Romans would treat the citizenship thing, right? Gradually, right? Just for those who actually distinguish themselves for a sort of individual merit according to tradition, and not just all at once, or for the sake of that, erase from your mind the sense that Roman citizenship was just an act of tolerance, right? The Romans made these people sweat and bleed a lot before getting that, and this is in fact a beautiful principle. In the first place, only the better people deserve rights. And this inscription not only shows, and it consistently, right, the fact that the Romans, in fact, rewarded only to be at their level, only those who deserve to be so, and keeping to rule on the locals as such, right? This would open, right? This would the citizenship open for the locals over the other locals, right? Divided by quality. And how this process was, of course, a very effective means of cooptation, right? It shows also how, by this time, the second half of the 2nd century AD, the advancement of Roman control over the central Atlas region really was, because the Zagrenses tribe, from which this Julianus naturally was given a Roman name as a Roman citizen, but God knows how he was actually called in Berber, was just in the area, and so at least it was a mean to reinforce that frontier as well. We know also of the stipulation of foedera, that is, alliances, as you know, with Berber tribes. That is to say, okay, you would become an ally of Rome, and this was done normally from a condition of, again, Roman superiority. So these were tribes that did not live because the province naturally had some boundaries, but towards the south, you couldn't really tell where it technically ended, right? This is typical. So basically, whoever was gravitating around this world domination was sucked into, and Rome extended naturally a control that went very far beyond what we consider as the frontier, say the border, the limes, that technically the Romans didn't even understand as a concept, because it didn't exist at all as an ecumenic empire, and this means, of course, that there were external tribes, say from the territory the Romans directly occupied, and naturally were also co-opted, that were allied with Rome, and that with whom Rome hoped to extend further also some degree of territorial control, and preventing especially the interland, let's say the richest interland areas towards the Mediterranean, to be preventing them from being threatened, harassed, raided, things like that. This thing goes on as during the same Berber dynasty of the Severi, the control of the Atlas was military strengthened through the establishment of the so-called Nova Praetentura. The Praetentura was the part of the Roman encampment between the Via Principalis and the Porta Praetoria, right? So forming a sort of, in fact, buffer area. That's the name of frontier that was used in this strategic sense instead. And this Nova Praetentura was located south of the mountain range to monitor the movement of the nomadic population, right? So in the same way, preventing them from kind of getting too much inland, kind of stopping them before, coping with them essentially with the same, more or less with the same tactics that were practiced there from quite a while, but weren't that distant from the ones used also in other places. Just think about the same Iberian ones, or again, the Roman army at this point could field any type of citizenry kind of force equipped with whichever fashion was needed. Now, what did the Romans get from Mauretania as a broader province? So, as any of these lands, the economy was based on agriculture. Right. This was obviously more intensive in the, let's say, at least in terms of output in the urban region, right, in absolute terms, than the outer areas were, generally speaking, less fertile in the first place. They may have also been administered in a more fragmented fashion, maybe in relative terms even better, but who knows, because the latifundia were mostly instead. They were very, very productive and well run in a way, but there was also less incentive at a certain point to just invest continuously in such large estates that by themselves gave you enough. Right. The proof of such agricultural surplus is just embodied by a fair number of cities. Right. That's the main indicator. Right. Urbanization corresponds to a certain type of civilizational development. These areas could support it, so that's the same reason why the Romans occupied this land permanently, and in fact began to build such cities on the pre-existing settlements. Mauretania was not as fertile as we were saying before, as the Bagradas Valley, on which the proconsular Africa, essentially Tunisia, was based. As a consequence, also the connection of Mauretania with other provinces for agricultural, say, kind of grain supplies, things like that, was more contained. But all in all, it was a larger area, right? So it still provided Rome with substantial surplus. On the Atlantic, as much on the Mediterranean, fishing was widespread, right? In Tingitana, the garum was produced and exported, right? This was the case for many coastal regions of the empire. The garum fish sauce is essentially stemming from a sort of fermentation and eventually treatment of the juice that comes out of the garum left in some containers under the sun, and with salt, right? So to avoid putrefaction. This was notoriously one of the most famous Roman seasoning at the time. Were different qualities, but the top one was really, really expensive. Valuable wood came from the Atlas Mountains. The Moroccan Atlantic cedar is a famous tree, as much as the Lebanon cedar that also was exported from the provinces, from that province at least. And overall, like, you can imagine contacts with the sub-Saharan Africa as well, that mostly, the route, say most routes of which pass through actually the desert in Central Africa, but also following the coast and rising up the Atlas again. There was a lot of also cattle being moved during the transhumance of this Berber nomads that occasionally descended into the Roman towns to just sell their products. So there were surely all the various exports from the south, from also gold, ivory, slaves, right? This was part of the broader route towards Black Africa, and yeah, that's pretty much. Naturally, this is just an introduction. If you want, at some point, we can make something on the economy of these regions more in depth. More or less, you understand the idea. It's as always in pre-industrial time, a sound agricultural basis plus some extras or some commodities that you could extract to say you could profit from. And the Romans again were dominating this area, so they had a greater control on certain dynamics than the locals, and this would made the accumulation of wealth back in the imperial homeland as well. All right, this was just the broader outlook of the provinces. In this case, even for today. However, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.